Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, excellent. So thank you so much, Mike and Stella, for your kind words and for hosting us all here today. I also want to acknowledge that we have many distinguished guests who have traveled long distances to be here with us this afternoon, and I'm truly honored that you're in the audience. So as you've just heard, can we get the next slide? Okay, here we are. As you've just heard, I'm a theoretical physicist, and over my career, my research has touched a wide variety of topics, from string theory to quantum matter, from cosmology to black holes. And most recently, my research has focused on the connections between quantum information science and quantum gravity. And in fact, that's what's brought me here this week to Bali. I and around 50 other experts from around the world have gathered at this workshop, and we're discussing the latest developments in the research at the intersection of these two very exciting fields. Now, I would have been happy to give a presentation on this topic, and such a talk would actually have started with a slide that looks like this. And so with that picture and a bit of a story, I would have begun by conveying the excitement that my colleagues and I feel about this research and our collective progress over the past few years. But of course, that is not today's talk. Instead, I'll be talking about another topic that's still very near and dear to me. Because as Mike was saying, until very recently, back in Waterloo, a relatively small city in the middle of Canada, I had another job. I was the director of the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics. And there we study a wide range of topics cutting a broad swath across modern theoretical physics. From cosmology to quantum information to particle physics, or as we like to say, from the infinite to the infinitesimal. At Perimeter, we have faculty, we have postdocs, and we have students, all of whom, like me, are pursuing deep questions, probing the boundaries of our understanding of theoretical physics. I think the job of being Perimeter's director is maybe one of the best jobs in the whole world. You see, you get to lead this team of about 200 young innovators. They're real trailblazers exploring new frontiers. Theirs is a journey of discovery and a journey of the mind as we take on some of the deepest and most profound questions about the inner workings of the universe. Of course, Perimeter is just one of a constellation of universities, organizations, and institutes around the world, from China to India, from Europe to South America. You'll find many extraordinary places like this filled with explorers, all on their own journey of discovery. Now, the precise interests and the mission may vary from place to place, but we all share a common spirit. Our explorations push out the boundaries of human knowledge. It's incredible and exciting work. But let's be honest, sometimes it's a little hard to explain. But as the Institute's director, that's one of my jobs, to translate what we do for government officials, for business women, for private donors, for science enthusiasts. Of course, again, I try and convey our excitement about the research that we all share, but eventually, and very often, very quickly, the conversations turn from what we do to why we do it. As physicists, the why is intuitive. We do it because we're excited and driven by the explorations themselves. For us, it is obvious that the desire for new knowledge, the quest to expand the frontiers of our understanding, is and always has been a part of our humanity. As people, we are drawn to the edge, bound together by a shared curiosity. That curiosity is an essential element of the human condition. But when most of the people I talked to were asking why we study theoretical physics, what they were really asking is, what is your research good for? And so this afternoon, I want to try and address that question more seriously. What is fundamental research good for? Or put another way, if we are explorers, then why do we explore? Now, theoretical physicists are fans of thought experiments. So if you'll permit me, let's start there with a thought experiment. Imagine a city, perhaps New York or Paris or London, at the end of the 19th century, about 130 years ago. It's a different world, but you might recognize the spirit of the time. The last few generations have brought huge advances: the telegraph, steam power, transcontinental railways. Living standards have increased dramatically. Cities have grown by leaps and bounds, becoming great engines of economic growth and prosperity. But with these changes have also come large challenges: overcrowding, disease, urban poverty, perhaps even civil unrest. So in 1898, delegates from cities around the globe gathered in New York City for what was the world's very first urban planning conference. And there was one overwhelming problem that dominated the discussion. It wasn't infrastructure, it wasn't housing or poverty or economic development. It was horse manure. Everything and everyone in these large cities of the Western world was moved by horses. For example, in New York City, there were 100,000 horses, and all combined, they were creating 1 million kilos of manure every day. It was ankle deep in some streets. It was knee deep in others. In London, the famous newspaper, The Times, predicted that by 1950, every street would be buried 9 feet deep in horse manure. This was happening in cities around the world. It was an environmental crisis, a public health crisis. So now imagine a story. In one of those far-off cities, a committee is formed with the task of investing funds to build a better future. A young man comes into the room and sits down. He says, "I'd like a small grant." "For what?" they want to know. "Well, for my work. I need a desk, a blackboard, maybe a shelf for my books, a small stipend so that I can go to a few conferences." They ask, "What are you working on?" And he says, "Well, I have these ideas about life. It's very complicated." At this point, the committee members cut him off, saying, "Excuse me, Dr. Einstein, what does that have to do with horse manure?" Now, Einstein never actually applied for municipal funding to fund his research, but let us for a moment imagine the return on investment if he had. Einstein is often portrayed as the ultimate abstract thinker, someone whose ideas have had or have no effect on our day-to-day lives. But in fact, his ideas set a foundation for a myriad of devices and technologies that are so commonplace that we take them for granted today. Without Einstein's foundations, we'd have no semiconductors, no computers, no lasers, no GPS, no modern medical imaging. It's a very, very long list. But let's pick one example. Smartphones. Now, I'm willing to wager that everybody in this room actually carries one of these marvelous devices. 2, okay. In this case, 2 phones make you more productive. Okay, excellent. Oh dear. Well, I want to say that, much more than a telephone, these marvelous gizmos are connectors, they're enablers, they're amplifiers. A farmer in Nigeria can use her cell phone to connect to financial services, to get weather information, or to coordinate the transportation of her crops. Anecdotally, I can add that half of the apps on my home screen actually provide me with different ways to communicate with my daughters. That is, to get their attention. Now, experience has taught me that trying to use this as a telephone is perhaps the least effective way to get their attention. In any event, when our farmer in Nigeria or one of my daughters uses her phone, she's benefiting from 2 centuries of investments in theoretical physics. This device depends on Maxwell's equations from 150 years ago, Einstein's relativity from 110 years ago, and a whole lot of quantum mechanics over the past 100 years. It is, in fact, a triumph of theoretical physics. Now, when I conduct this thought experiment with a government official or a private donor, I'm hoping to convince them that investing in theoretical physics is a good idea, that it will, with time, generate a whole new generation of gizmos that our great-great-grandchildren might benefit from. Now, that's true as far as it goes. But remember where we started in my thought experiment, a world in trouble. Well, our world today, like the one I described, faces urgent problems. The problems are very real, and we must confront them with speed, creativity, and energy. And yet, the lesson from my thought experiment is we must not set our horizon with our problems, because the horizon of our imagination is just so much bigger than the horizon of our problems. Throughout history, unlocking the great potential of the human mind, our capacity to think, to wonder, to ask bold questions, has been the source of every great leap forward. These extraordinary capabilities have taken imagination to reality and expanded the horizon of what is possible. Now, as a physicist interested in gravity, I think a lot about horizons. Literal horizons, figurative horizons, horizons we can prove exist mathematically, and horizons that we can see. Black holes are perhaps the most interesting objects in gravitational physics. They're bottomless pits of space and time. They're characterized by something called the event horizon. That's a surface where the gravitational pull becomes so strong that nothing, not even light, can escape. Hence, it is literally a boundary beyond which we can't see. In fact, it looks something like this, perhaps like this. Nope. Help. We advance one slide, please. When we advance, we'll see a photograph that was taken of the black hole M87 by the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration. Now, M87 is a monster. It's 6.5 billion times as massive as our own sun and it spans a space that's 4 times bigger than our entire solar system. It's huge. But it's also 55 million light years away at the heart of an entirely other galaxy. Hence, the light captured to make this image was emitted from M87 55 million years ago. To get something that far away into focus, you need a telescope that would let us here in Bali read a newspaper in Taipei, or to see a hockey puck on the surface of the moon. Now, as a Canadian, I'm a big fan of ice hockey, but I know that might not quite be the right analogy for us here today. So instead of a hockey puck, let's say that you'll see a badminton shuttlecock on the surface of the moon. When it comes to black holes, we've been speculating and theorizing, even making indirect observations for decades now. But this picture, which was revealed 5 years ago, gave us something new, direct visual proof that black holes exist. And I want to emphasize, this is not a simulation, it's not an artist's impression, this is a photograph, one that captured the imagination of the world. In fact, it appeared on the front page of nearly every major newspaper around the globe. It's estimated that 4.5 billion people have actually seen this image. That's half of the world's population. And so this image is now something that's transcended science and become an inspiration for people around the world. In fact, a copy of it hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, we can see black holes, but we can also hear them. And I'm clicking with some trepidation. So, an observatory called LIGO captured this signal back in 2015. It's the gravitational shock wave that's coming from the collision of 2 black holes, each about 30 times the mass of the sun. For a few milliseconds, as those 2 black holes, these waves had plenty of space and time spreading out across the cosmos, and as they did so, they died down. And so this first wave that was detected by LIGO had been traveling for more than 1 billion years. And when it washed up against the Earth, it in fact was absolutely tiny. Now, researchers detected these tiny ripples in space-time by carefully tracking the length of very long arms, here about 4 kilometers long, at the LIGO detector. And when the gravitational waves passed through it, it stretched and squashed the length of those arms, but not by much. It stretches them by less than the width of a hair, less than the width of a virus, in fact, less than the width of a single atom. And so this new observatory is an incredible feat of human ingenuity. If we want to capture better pictures of these gravitational waves, there are 2 ways to go. One is we can get better at measuring those differences in length, but the other is to build observatories with larger arms. Towards that end, a new generation of gravitational detectors will be based in space. And instead of measuring the distance between end masses that are about 4 kilometers apart, we'll be measuring the distance between satellites that are millions of kilometers apart. Work on this new project called LISA is well underway now, and it is expected to launch in about a decade. One of the reasons that we're confident that this is going to work is because there are already satellites that measure gravity in this way. In fact, this picture is not an artist's impression of LISA, but rather of something known as the GRACE satellites. Actually, this is the GRACE follow-on mission that was launched in 2017. So by carefully measuring the distance between this pair of satellites, one can detect subtle changes in the Earth's gravitational field, which of course is determined by the mass. Now here in this picture, one sees that the Earth's mass is not distributed equally. That is, that the Earth is not a perfectly smooth Earth, but rather what we're seeing here are what are called gravity anomalies detected by GRACE. The red regions show the areas where the gravity is stronger, whereas the blue show regions where the gravity is weaker. So while the mass of the Earth may not be distributed perfectly smoothly, the GRACE satellites can also track the way that the Earth's mass moves around over time. So what mass would be moving? Well, it's mostly water. So in this slide, what we're seeing is GRACE tracking the depletion of the glaciers in Greenland. Not just what we see on the surface, but in terms of the total mass of those glaciers. The staircase pattern in the graph on the far right over there is actually showing us the seasons playing out over many years. However, the trend is clear. The glaciers in Greenland are slowly melting. Now, GRACE can also track what's happening in aquifers under the Earth. Here we see what the groundwater situation in southern Asia looks like from space. There are areas in red where freshwater resources are being depleted, as we see in northern India, in Bangladesh, and also along the Malaysian peninsula. So now let's go back to the question, what's theoretical physics good for? Well, here is half the answer. It's good for precisely this. Theoretical physics is a seed. It starts with an Einstein. It takes us to black holes, to gravitational wave detectors, and ultimately to images of groundwater that we just couldn't possibly get in any other way. So theoretical physics puts climate data in the hands of policymakers in Geneva, a phone in the hands of a farmer in Nigeria, and an MRI imaging machine in the hands of a doctor here in Jakarta. Investing in theoretical physics rarely pays off right away, but it almost always pays off in the long run, and the payoff is enormous. Now, I said that was half the answer. So what's the other half of the answer? Well, if the COVID pandemic taught us anything, it's that we do not know what problems the future is going to throw at us. We know there will be many. The climate crisis is real. The pandemic of the last few years will not be the last. There are global inequalities, environmental degradation, food security, the list goes on. These problems are real. We also know that the resources for addressing these problems are finite. There's only so much time, talent, and energy in the world. These constraints are real. So given that our problems are urgent, given that our resources are finite, what are we doing? How do we justify spending our time, as many of us in the conference are doing, studying holographic entanglement entropy or von Neumann algebra? How do we justify pure curiosity-driven exploration? The truth is that we don't know exactly how breakthroughs in fundamental research, be they in science and biology or any other of the sciences, how those breakthroughs might change the world. But it's vitally important that we invest in and strive for those breakthroughs anyway. Let's look back at the COVID vaccine program. In the wake of the emergence of COVID-19, private companies and governments alike made big investments. Scientists around the world worked together, and we had effective vaccines in just 11 months, faster than any new vaccine had been ever developed. It was a miracle that saved millions of lives. Now, many of the COVID vaccines were of a brand new kind called mRNA vaccines. Now, why did we end up with these vaccines just when we needed them? Well, it was because of decades of fundamental research. The discovery of the science of heredity came more than 100 years ago. The discovery of the molecules of heredity, DNA and then RNA, came more than 50 years ago. These discoveries weren't made with vaccines in mind. They weren't made with anything in mind, except that we as scientists, as humans, wanted to understand the world at a deeper, more fundamental level. And of course, that work kept going. In the 1970s, we learned how to sequence these molecules. In the 1980s, we could make mass copies of DNA so that we could work with it in the lab. In the 1990s, we learned to use RNA to create proteins in glass test tubes in the lab. Then came further decades of uphill work that made it possible to use these discoveries in practical ways. It must be said that at many turns, these advances came with the dogged determination of the scientists involved. While she isn't a household name to most of us, Kathleen Karioko is in fact a Nobel Prize winner, and we owe her a great deal of thanks. Her persistence in her field over many decades, often in the face of skepticism from her colleagues, in the face of challenges for funding her research, laid the foundation for the rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine. When the vaccines were released, some people were frightened. They wondered if the process had been rushed. Of course it hadn't. The vaccine developers didn't skip a single safety step. Instead, they were able to quickly build on a solid foundation built over decades. My point is that the science wasn't rushed. In fact, the science was older than anyone ever taught us about, and its roots went deep. And at the root, the very core of this success was curiosity. Our ability to question, to imagine, to think is the most powerful engine of progress. It's research like this that lets us move beyond the narrow horizon set by our problems into a bigger world, a world whose horizon is set by our imagination. Now, if we knew how curiosity-driven research into biology leads to vaccines that then save millions of lives, if we could map the path from A to B, life would be easy. We would simply invest a lot of talent and resources into A and then wait for the dividends to roll in at B. But it doesn't work like that. We can rarely see that path. In fact, a medical researcher named Samuel Broder, who directed the National Cancer Institute in the United States from 1989 to 1995, the researchers at the Institute during that period were doing amazing work. And so it might be a surprise to learn that Broder was actually opposed to a centralized, whole-of-government effort to fight cancer. And in trying to explain his position, he asserted that if it had been up to the government to cure polio, we'd have the best iron lungs in the world, but not a polio vaccine. In other words, he expected that the government would have invested in the best, most promising technologies that we had, the things where the path from A to B seemed relatively obvious. They would have tackled our immediate problems head on. But if we invest all of our energy in these immediate solutions, we'll never move past the horizon of our problem. I'm not saying that we shouldn't tackle those problems. Of course we should. If people can't breathe, we should develop iron lungs. But we must not stop there. We must also take chances on long shot ideas, the polio vaccine ideas, and even beyond that, we should take chances on the blue sky ideas that have no practical aim at all. The Einstein idea. Fundamental research, curiosity-driven research, is so important, not because we know it will pay off, but because it lays a foundation for a different kind of a world. It is the deep work that we do today that makes the immediate solutions possible tomorrow. Now I want to take that argument one step further. I've said that we want to move past the horizon set by our problem toward a horizon set by our imagination. But beyond our imaginations, there's another horizon, an even bigger world, the world of what's possible. Now how do we reach towards this third largest horizon? How do we find a world that literally is beyond anything that we can imagine today? I would argue that it's exactly by pursuing this kind of research, the kind that inspires people, that's purely driven by our curiosity and not the question of what's that good for. This is not a new idea. In fact, almost 90 years ago, Abraham Flexner published a short essay on the usefulness of useless knowledge. He was the founding director of the Institute for Advanced Study, a center for theoretical research in Princeton, in the United States. It was the home of many of the 20th century's great thinkers, people like Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, and many, many more. Flexner's essay was published in 1939. It was published in the United States, a country caught in the teeth of the Great Depression, in the grip of a climate crisis called the Dust Bowl, and it argued for pure curiosity. The opening story stuck with me. Flexner recounts a conversation with George Eastman, one of the founders of the Eastman Kodak Company. Eastman was an inventor, an entrepreneur. He was also a philanthropist and a public intellectual. He told Flexner that he wanted to devote his vast fortune in the promotion of education in useful subjects. So since they were talking about usefulness, Flexner asked Eastman who he regarded as the most useful worker in science in the world. Eastman quickly replied, Marconi, of course. Now this was a reasonable choice, of course. In 1995, Guglielmo Marconi built equipment and transmitted electromagnetic signals through the air from one end of his house to the other, and then from the house out into the garden. And if you read the history books, you'll see that this was cited as the dawn of wireless communication, the dawn of radio. This was the information technology that stitched together the world as Flexner and Eastman knew it. So Eastman told Flexner Marconi was the most useful. But Flexner's reply was Marconi is inevitable, or was inevitable. The real credit, he said, belonged to James Maxwell, the person who figured out electricity and magnetism are part of the same force, and they move together in electromagnetic waves. Maxwell's famous equations were developed over 15 years and published in 1873. This was followed by a period of fast-moving, pure science, and also the birth of a new era, a new technology. Maxwell had no practical objective. Even after he had made the discovery, he saw no practical application. A German physicist, Hertz, also said as much. The spark gap transmitter that Hertz had built was arguably, in fact, the world's first radio, predating Marconi by nearly a decade. But when asked about it, Hertz said, "It's of no use whatsoever." Oh my goodness. I just saw a sign in the back telling me that I have to go at warp speed, I guess. So people like, what Hertz said is that it's of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves that the maestro Maxwell was right. He proved that electromagnetic waves exist all around us, and that was enough for him. People like Hertz and Maxwell, people like me, the researchers at this workshop, it's curiosity that drives them, not usefulness. Now, Flexner argued, and I'm arguing, that the most of the really great discoveries are ideas that have changed the world were made by men and women who were not driven by the desire to be useful, but merely the desire to satisfy their curiosity. Now, Flexner's book, or an essay carrying Flexner's essay, sits on my shelf back in my office in Perimeter. And I want to go back to that. Perimeter is not a university, but a research center with about 200 researchers, from students to world-leading scientists. We're one of the largest independent theoretical physics institutes in the world. It's also a fairly young institute, as the IAS was in Flexner's day, and it's young enough that I can tell you the origin story, because I was there. In fact, it was the brainchild of Mike Lazaridis, the gentleman who took pagers, hooked them up to the internet, and created the BlackBerry. When I first met Mike, he was transforming the BlackBerry into the first full-fledged smartphone. And I think that he knew that he was about to reshape the world, but the day I met him, he didn't want to talk about that. He told you, or told me, what I told you earlier, that the smartphone is a triumph of theoretical physics. 150 years of breakthroughs packaged in a sleek little box. Now, I could tell you more, but Mike's idea was that if his smartphone depended on breakthroughs, then where were the next breakthroughs going to come from? The ones that would shape the lives of our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren. He had an idea or an answer to that, of course, and that was the Perimeter Institute. I found the discussion so compelling that I found myself a few days later saying, "I'm in, how can I help?" In fact, I left a tenured position at a distinguished universities with traditions stretching back over 100 years for a place that didn't even exist at the time. Perimeter was barely an idea, and when I arrived, there wasn't even an office for me to work in. Now, people told me that I was crazy, and maybe I was, but it was the right move, because now, 25 years later, Perimeter is a world-leading institute, and we're all working to understand the universe at its most basic level. Again, as the director, almost every day people ask me what this is good for, and the honest answer is, we don't know. Just as Maxwell didn't know, just as Einstein didn't know, just as the biologists who discovered DNA and RNA didn't know. Some of it may not be good for anything at all. We need to be honest and acknowledge that. Moving beyond the horizon of our imagination is not an efficient process. Nevertheless, if we try and predict what that payoff will be, if we make promises about returns on investment or on key performance indicators, we're putting science in a straitjacket, and most often we're simply wrong. So let me give you an example of how we might be wrong, or how we might be wrong. You know, as I described, there are 9 different areas of research at Perimeter, but there was one dark horse in the lineup for all of that time, and that was quantum foundations. Now, at the time of the beginning of the Institute, that was the last pace that most physicists would have placed a bet for a payoff, even in the long term. When I talk to people about Perimeter, often they voice skepticism, and in fact, sometimes they laughed in my face when I brought up quantum foundations. Now, what is quantum foundations? It's really looking at the underpinnings of quantum theory, the theory of physics at the very small scale. What does quantum theory really mean, conceptually and mathematically? As I said, this was not an obvious choice for a new physics institute, but it's one of the ideas, one of the areas that Mike Lazaridis insisted on. In fact, it's one of the very few things that he insisted on at Perimeter. So we hired some quantum foundations experts, very much against the prevailing view of what was likely to be useful or even successful. And now fast forward 24 years, and suddenly one of the most exciting new things coming out of Perimeter is actually driven by our quantum foundations team, and it's called quantum causal inference. I'm going to go very quickly through this, and I apologize, I miscalculated my time. But causal inference is the science, it's the detective work by which we draw conclusions about cause and effect from data. Now, many of us may have heard the maxim that correlation does not apply causation. But causal inference researchers develop statistical tests that we can apply to data that do let us say things about cause and effect. Now, this touches on a vast number of areas: medicine, economics, artificial intelligence, epidemiology. For example, one might ask, a central bank raises its interest rates, the stock market rises. Was the market reacting to the monetary policy, or was it something else? Or could it have been that there were other factors at play, factors that we can't see or perhaps can't even imagine? These unknowns could be driving the cause these two rises. These are the kinds of questions that researchers in causal inference might delve into. So that's causal inference. How does quantum foundations come in? Well, one of the most famous results in quantum foundations is something developed by a physicist, John Bell, who was working in Geneva in 1964. And he proposed a statistical test by which we could test the very nature of reality. To set the context, in the early days of quantum theory, many physicists hoped that there was an underlying theory, and this was sort of a statistical approximation, much in the way that the temperature and the pressure in the air in this room represent some approximate or average measures of the behavior of atoms and molecules that make up the air. And so people hoped that there should be another layer of simpler physics by which they meant physics closer to Newton's laws or to Maxwell's electromagnetism that gave rise to quantum theory. Now, Bell's experiment, which was later carried out in a laboratory, involved people making 2 sets of measurements and seeing how often those measurements agreed. Now, what Bell showed is that if the measurements agreed more than above a certain threshold, then there could be no simpler layer beneath the quantum theory. There could be no hidden rules or hidden degrees of freedom. For decades now, researchers in Quantum Foundation have used Bell's work as a microscope to take a deeper look into the nature of quantum theory. Now, in 2012, a researcher, Rob Speckens, on the left here, had the insight to think about Bell's theorem and recast it in the language of causal inference in terms of cause and effect. But he realized that quantum physicists were sitting on decades of results about causal inference. He also realized that he could use the ideas, the techniques developed in Quantum Foundation, like Bell's theorem, to help advance causal inference, in particular to identify those unknown unknowns or other factors. He was joined by Ellie Wolf on the right here, and they made a small team that now collaborates on these ideas with medical researchers, insurance companies, and in artificial intelligence folks. Now, I will simply say that this is a remarkable result. It's one that's coming out and could have an amazing and immediate effect on many different aspects of our great data-driven world. And if we were to have bet at Perimeter that this was going to be useful, even in what is really a tiny period of time, like 20 years, no one would have bet on Quantum Foundation. And we would have all been wrong. But we didn't bet. We were curious. We explored. And hence the result. And that's what the question, that's why the question of what's that good for is so hard to answer. Now, the world was once defined by scarcity, by fixed resources, that there never seemed to be enough to go around. Our problems today may seem insurmountable. We can feel like the delegates at that first urban planning conference. What they didn't realize, and what we sometimes forget, is that solutions are possible, solutions that we cannot even imagine yet. Curiosity-based research has laid a foundation for a new kind of world, a world that expands and creates more for everyone. It creates health, it creates wealth, it moves us across oceans and into space, it spreads our ideas through the air and puts all of human knowledge in our pockets. It feeds us, it creates wonder. I can't tell you what the discovery will be that will change the world for our grandchildren's grandchildren, but I hope that I've shared a little of my optimism with you today. The solutions to our greatest challenges and the path to the future full of possibility lies in our ability to unlock humanity's greatest resource, our mind. It is through curiosity, through exploration, that and the pursuit of knowledge that we empower this resource. This investment not only solves problems, but redefines what is possible, inspiring a better world for generations to come. I talked about not letting our problems set our horizon, the horizon of our problems being so much smaller than the horizon of our imagination. And beyond that, the horizon of what is possible is unimaginably large, rich, and beautiful. So may we all continue to look toward that horizon and dare to explore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Myers. Please don't go anywhere. I would like to open the floor for some questions. I think we have time for only one or two questions. Someone will pass the mic. Please.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon for everybody. Before I am asking, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Tasrif. I am representing Director of Hasanuddin University in Makassar, which is 1.5 hour flight from here. I am very delighted to be here, listening to your stimulating and inspiring talk. And what I would like to ask is that how to put the bottom line of your talk in the context of Indonesian people with the several dreamings. We are going to have a golden anniversary that we expect to be the advanced country. We also dream that contributing to the global development of science. In analogy, we dream as a people, as a nation, to also represent it in the World Cup in 2026. There is a kind of analogy because the Indonesian government invents to the team of the World Cup. So we put in this context, we have to also Indonesian government invest so that Indonesian people also contribute to the development of science globally. Now the question is, if we were to also build a research institute, perhaps not in the same class of perimeter or ICTP built by Abdul Salam or Riken in Japan, all those research institutes having giants. Abdul Salam, Shinichiro Tomonaga, and Perimeter Institute. The question is, in terms of the capacity, because we are quite affluent with the natural resources, so maybe we can sort of ask those giants to be the leader in our institute we plan, because somehow it is impossible to achieve the dream of Indonesian people to be the advanced country by the time in 200. We celebrate 100 a golden years of our independence. So really, if you as an expert ask, do Indonesian people are able to build in terms of the budget and in terms of the capacity of Indonesian people in order to build this research institute, so that we are also no longer less represented in science but also contributing significantly? That's my question. Thank you very much.
So I would start by saying that I also come from a country that is affluent in natural resources, a country that not that long ago was not very ambitious, and so I think you've already taken that very first step, the necessary step to set an ambitious goal. But I think in science you have to do what I imagine, I'm not a sports player or a soccer player, that you do the same thing that you do when you're investing in the soccer teams. You're investing in the youth. You're giving them opportunities to play. You're looking for talented youth, and elevating them and giving them even better opportunities. And I think the same is very much true of science and research, whether it's theoretical physics or biology or something else. One starts by looking to the youth. I think Indonesia, like any country in the world, you have amazing, you will find that you have amazing human capital, brilliant young minds. And so it's really providing them with, or a first step that I would recommend is providing them with opportunity, providing them with a culture or an atmosphere where going towards research is admired and can be seen as successful. And so I think that, you are not just affluent in natural resources, but you will find that you are affluent in human talent. And it's really developing, nurturing, and helping that talent grow towards, to unlock their potential. So I'm not sure that I answered the question entirely the way you wanted. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I would like to take an attempt to answer that question as well. I totally agree with Rob's answer. And I want to point out something that's truly important. The government needs to invest, but at this time, we need to invest in research in universities. We cannot right away build a great institute if there are no great research in universities. So I think Rob would agree that Perimeter Institute will not be feasible to be built if there are no already strong universities around it, wouldn't you say so, Rob, right?
No, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Over time, Canada has also developed a very strong tradition in research.
Yeah.
And much of that research, even today, comes from
universities. And so we have to work together. Of course, the government needs to make an investment. We need to make a better regulation. We need to change the ecosystem so that the research are first and foremost done in universities by all of you. Thank you.